The Pope of the Catholic Church stood in a hallway that smelled of mildew and urine, his white cassock brushed against a wall where the paint was peeling in long yellow strips. And in front of him, sitting on a metal bed with no sheets, was a 92-year-old priest who had served the church for 67 years. The old man looked up. He didn't recognize the Pope. He couldn't because no one from the church had visited him in over 4 years. What Pope Leo XIV discovered inside that building on July 4th, 2026, broke something inside him. And what he did next sent shockwaves through the entire Catholic world. But to understand why the leader of 1.4 billion Catholics wept that day, you need to know what led him to that doorstep in the first place. And it started with a single envelope. On the morning of July 3rd, 2026, Pope Leo XIV sat in his private study inside the Apostolic Palace. The room was modest, a wooden desk, a crucifix on the wall, a stack of documents that never seemed to shrink. His Augustinian brothers had already left for morning prayers. The Pope had stayed behind. Something was waiting for him. He had barely slept. The previous day had been intense. The SPX crisis was still unfolding. The global media was dissecting every detail of the schism. Vatican communication staff were overwhelmed. Diplomats were calling. Cardinals were sending memos. The church felt like it was being pulled in every direction at once. But it wasn't the schism keeping the Pope awake. It was an envelope. It had arrived the night before through unofficial channels. Not through the Secretariat of State, not through the Dicastery for Communication. It came through a Franciscan nun who worked in the Vatican postal office. She had received it from a parish priest in Calabria, who had received it from a retired mason, who knew a retired bishop, who knew someone who could get something directly to the Pope's desk. The envelope had passed through 6 pairs of hands. None of them had opened it. All of them understood its urgency. No Vatican seal, no return address. Just a plain white envelope with 2 words handwritten on the front. Read this. The Pope opened the envelope. Inside was a 7-page letter, handwritten, shaky handwriting, the kind that comes from hands that have trembled for years. It was from a priest named Father Thomas Herrera, 89 years old, based in a retirement facility for clergy in southern Italy near Cosenza. Father Herrera had been a parish priest for 53 years. He had baptized thousands, married hundreds of couples, buried more people than he could count. He had given everything to the church, and now he wrote, "The church had forgotten me." The letter described conditions that would be unthinkable for any institution, let alone the wealthiest religious organization on earth. The retirement home where Father Herrera lived housed 31 elderly priests. Most were over 80, some were bedridden. The building had no air conditioning. The letter described conditions that would be unthinkable for any institution, let alone the wealthiest religious organization on earth. The retirement home where Father Herrera lived housed 31 elderly priests. Most were over 80, some were bedridden. The building had no air conditioning. In the Italian summer, temperatures inside reached over 30 degrees Celsius. The plumbing was failing. Hot water was available only 2 days a week. Medical visits had been cut from weekly to monthly because the diocese had stopped funding the resident nurse position. 3 priests had died in the past 18 months. One of them, Father Herrera wrote, died alone at night, and his body wasn't discovered until the following afternoon. Pope Leo read the letter twice. Then he set it down on his desk and stared at the wall for a long time. But what disturbed him most wasn't the conditions. It was a single line near the end of the letter. Father Herrera wrote, "I do not blame God. I blame the men who run his house." The Pope picked up the phone. He called Archbishop Domenico Ferrara, the head of the Dicastery for Clergy. Ferrara was in a meeting. The Pope told the assistant to interrupt it. When Ferrara came on the line, the Pope asked one question. How many retired priests in Italy are currently living in church-managed facilities? Ferrara hesitated. He said he would need to check. The Pope told him he had 2 hours. What came back was worse than the letter. The data showed that across Italy alone, there were over 140 facilities housing retired clergy. But here is what no one in the Vatican wanted to talk about. 61 of those facilities had received no diocesan funding increase in over a decade. 23 had been flagged by local health authorities for substandard conditions. 14 had lost their full-time medical staff. And in at least 9 cases, the facilities were technically bankrupt, surviving only on the personal pensions of the priests living inside them. Retired priests in Italy receive a pension of roughly $1,000 per month. Some receive less. That money is supposed to cover their basic needs. But in many of these homes, the priests were also paying for the upkeep of the building itself. They were funding their own neglect. The Pope asked Ferrara a second question. Did you know about this? Ferrara said there had been reports, concerns raised at regional meetings, notes in annual budgets. The Pope interrupted him. Notes and budgets are not action. Notes are how institutions bury their shame. That afternoon, the Pope made a decision that stunned his closest advisors. He told Mr. Apollo Visconti, his private secretary, to arrange a visit, not a formal one. No press, no advanced team, no coordination with local bishops. He wanted to go himself to the facility in Cosenza, the one Father Herrera had written about. Visconti tried to talk him out of it. The logistics were complicated, the security risks were real. The optics of a surprise papal visit to a failing facility could embarrass the local diocese. The Pope looked at him and said, "The optics of abandoning dying priests are worse." They left Rome before dawn on July 4th. A small convoy, 2 cars, the Pope, Visconti, 2 Swiss guards in plain clothes, and a Vatican physician the Pope had personally requested. No cameras, no journalists, no cardinals. They arrived in Cosenza just after 9 o'clock in the morning. The facility was called Casa San Jose. It sat on a narrow street on the edge of town. From the outside, it looked like any other aging Italian building. Stone walls, green shutters, a small courtyard with a dried-up fountain. But the moment the Pope stepped inside, everything changed. The smell hit first, a mix of disinfectant and something older, something deeper, decay. The floor tiles were cracked, the lighting was dim. In a hallway that smelled of mildew and urine, the Pope walked past rooms where the paint was peeling in long yellow strips. He entered a room where a 92-year-old priest sat on a metal bed with no sheets. The old man looked up, his eyes clouded, failing to recognize the man in the white cassock. He had served the church for 67 years, and in the last 4, no one had come to visit him. The physician moved through the facility, conducting a swift, grim assessment. He checked the medication logs, which were dangerously outdated, and examined the kitchen, which held nothing but expired cans and dry pasta. He pulled the Pope aside, his voice grim. He estimated that the facility was operating at roughly half the medical capacity needed for the population it housed. He added quietly that if a state-run institution for elderly civilians had been found in the same condition, it would have been shut down by Italian authorities within a week. The Pope absorbed this in silence. His face, usually a mask of calm, was pale. He knelt beside the 92-year-old priest, taking his thin, trembling hands into his own. "How long has the Church known about this?" the Pope asked, his voice low and vibrating with a suppressed, holy anger. The physician didn't answer. He didn't need to. Word of the visit had leaked. Someone in Cosenza had seen the cars. A local journalist had been tipped off. By late afternoon, Italian media was reporting that the Pope had made an unannounced visit to a clergy retirement home. The headlines were cautious at first, but by evening the story had exploded. Inside the Vatican, a different kind of reaction was forming. Several senior cardinals were furious, not at the conditions in Cosenza, but at the Pope. Cardinal Vittorio Santi, the head of the administration of the patrimony of the Apostolic See, called an emergency meeting. The problem, as Santi saw it, wasn't that priests were suffering. The problem was that the Pope had gone public with it. "This makes us look incompetent," Santi reportedly told his colleagues. He could have handled this internally, but the Pope had no interest in handling it internally. He had spent his entire papacy pushing against the instinct to hide. The Pope laid the documents on the table. He looked around the room and then said something that multiple sources later confirmed word for word. "We built palaces and let our fathers die in closets." The room went silent. Cardinal Santi tried to respond. He explained that diocesan finances are managed locally, that the Vatican provides guidelines but cannot dictate spending, and that many dioceses face complex financial pressures, including declining parish revenues and rising insurance costs. The Pope listened. Then he asked a question that Santi couldn't answer. How much did this institution spend on the Becciu trial? The reference was sharp. The long-running Vatican financial scandal involving Cardinal Angelo Becciu and the London property investment had cost the Vatican tens of millions of euros in legal fees alone. The Pope wasn't comparing the two directly. He was making a point. The Church always found money when it wanted to. The question was what it chose to spend it on. "We found money for lawyers," the Pope said. "We found money for marble. We found money for conferences about synodality and dialogues about dialogue, but we couldn't find money for the men who gave us their lives." Archbishop Ferrara spoke up. He acknowledged the failures and proposed forming a commission to study the issue and recommend reforms within 6 months. The Pope cut him off. 6 months? Father Ferretti died 2 weeks ago alone in a room with no call button. He waited 67 years for the Church to take care of him. He doesn't have 6 months. None of them do. The Pope announced 3 immediate actions. First, an emergency fund of $20 million would be redirected from the Vatican's general reserves to provide immediate relief to the most critical clergy retirement facilities across Europe. Second, every diocese worldwide would be required to submit a full accounting of its clergy retirement spending within 90 days. Third, a new office within the dicastery for clergy would be created specifically to oversee the welfare of retired priests, with the authority to intervene directly when facilities failed to meet minimum standards of care. Cardinal Santi objected to the financial reallocation, claiming it would create a dangerous precedent. The Pope responded, "The precedent we've set is abandonment. I'm changing it." The meeting lasted 2 hours. When it ended, one of the canon lawyers told a colleague that it was the most intense Vatican meeting he had attended in 30 years. The Pope wasn't angry. He said he was wounded, and a wounded Pope is far more dangerous than an angry one. But the story didn't end there. It was about to get much bigger. Later that evening, an Italian investigative journalist named Marco Ferretti, no relation to the deceased priest, published a long-form article based on months of independent research. The article revealed that the problem extended far beyond Italy, across Europe, Latin America, and parts of Africa. Thousands of retired priests were living in conditions that ranged from inadequate to deplorable. In Brazil, a retirement home for clergy in Minas Gerais had been operating without running water for 3 months. The priests there bathed using buckets filled from a neighbor's garden hose. In the Philippines, elderly priests in rural areas were surviving on donations from their former parishioners because their diocese had simply stopped sending support. One 86-year-old Filipino priest had been eating only 1 meal a day for 6 months. His former altar server, now a fisherman, brought him rice twice a week. That was the only guaranteed food he had. In Poland, a facility housing 26 retired priests had been condemned by local authorities, but continued operating because there was nowhere else for the men to go. The building had structural cracks in the foundation. The electrical wiring was decades out of code. One retired priest told the journalist he could hear the walls settling at night. He said it sounded like the building was sighing. The hashtag #OurForgottenFathers trended in multiple countries. Catholics around the world began responding not just with anger, but with tangible action. Parishes in Germany organized emergency collection drives. A Catholic women's group in Argentina raised $50,000 in 48 hours. A retired businessman in Chicago donated his vacation home to be converted into a clergy care facility. In Manila, medical students from a Catholic university volunteered to provide free health screenings at clergy retirement homes. The response was overwhelming, and it put enormous pressure on the Vatican to act even faster. On July 6th, the Pope did something unprecedented. He released a personal video message, not through the usual Vatican communications channels, not as an official papal address. He recorded it in his private study, sitting at his desk, looking directly at the camera. No script, no teleprompter, just the Pope speaking from the heart. He described what he had seen in Cosenza. He didn't spare details. He spoke about the cracked floors, the broken hearing aid, and the empty bed where Father Ferretti had died alone. He spoke about Father Herrera and the letter that had started everything. And then he said something that Catholic commentators would analyze for weeks. I knelt beside a man who gave his entire life to God through this church. And when I took his hands, I realized that we, the leaders of this church, had taken everything from him. His youth, his energy, his health, his years, and when he had nothing left to give, we turned away. This is not the church that Christ intended. This is not the church I will lead. He paused. And then he added, to every retired priest watching this, or to anyone who loves one, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not forgotten. Not anymore. This church owes you a debt it can never fully repay, but we will begin now. The video was viewed 18 million times in the first 24 hours. Comments poured in from every continent. Former altar servers, now in their 50s and 60s, wrote about the priests who had shaped their lives. Adult Catholics shared memories of parish priests who had baptized them, taught them, counseled them through divorces and deaths and crises of faith. And now they were learning that many of those priests were spending their final years alone, underfunded and forgotten. One comment went viral on its own. A woman in Ireland wrote, Father Brennan married my parents, baptized me and my 4 siblings, buried my grandmother, and sat with my mother every night for a week when my father died. He's 89 now. I just called his retirement home. They told me he hasn't had a visitor in 14 months. I'm driving there tomorrow. Thousands of similar stories followed. The Catholic world was waking up to something it had never wanted to see. But inside the Vatican, not everyone was moved. The resistance was real, and it came from a predictable place. Cardinal Santi and a group of senior financial administrators pushed back hard. They argued that the €20 million emergency fund would destabilize the Vatican's already fragile budget. They pointed to the ongoing costs of the Jubilee year, the rising expenses of Vatican security, and the need to maintain reserves for unforeseen crises. The Pope heard their arguments. He acknowledged the financial pressures, but he refused to back down. In a private conversation with Santi that was later described by 2 people present, the Pope said, I understand budgets. I ran the Augustinian order for 12 years. I know what a balance sheet looks like, but I also know what a dying priest looks like, and I will not balance our books on the backs of men who carry this church. Santi reportedly asked, what would happen if dioceses refused to comply with the new reporting requirements? The Pope's answer was simple. Then they will answer to me personally, and I promise you that conversation will not be pleasant. The days that followed saw a wave of activity across the Catholic world. Bishops who had ignored the retirement crisis for years were suddenly issuing public statements promising reform. Diocesan budgets were being re-examined. Facility inspections were being scheduled. In some cases, bishops were personally visiting retirement homes for the first time in their tenure. In Spain, the Archbishop of Seville announced an immediate redistribution of funds, diverting 1.5 million euros from a planned cathedral restoration to clergy retirement care. In Germany, the Bishops' Conference released a joint statement acknowledging systemic failures and pledging a comprehensive review. In the United States, where the retirement funding gap for religious orders had been a known crisis for decades, 3 major dioceses announced emergency fundraising campaigns within 48 hours. But the Pope wasn't naive. He had been in church leadership long enough to recognize the pattern. He had seen it during his 12 years running the Augustinian order. A crisis erupts, statements are made, promises are issued, the media moves on, and then slowly, quietly, everything returns to exactly the way it was before. He told Visconti privately, "Statements are the Church's favorite form of inaction. They make us feel like we've done something while guaranteeing that nothing changes." But the Pope knew that statements and promises were easy. Implementation was what mattered. He had seen too many Vatican reforms announced with great fanfare and then quietly shelved when the media moved on. So he did something that guaranteed the issue wouldn't disappear. He announced that the topic of his next major address, scheduled for late July, would be entirely dedicated to the care of retired clergy. He instructed his speechwriters to begin drafting what would become one of the most pointed papal addresses in modern history. And then there was the letter. On the evening of July 6th, the Pope sat down at his desk and wrote a personal letter back to Father Thomas Herrera. The contents of that letter were never made public, but Signor Mancini later told an Italian reporter that when she delivered the letter to Father Herrera's room the next morning, the old priest held it against his chest for a long time before opening it. When he finally read it, he smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile in over a year. She asked him what the Pope had written. Father Herrera looked up at her with those clouded eyes and said, "He told me. He heard me. That's all I ever wanted to hear." The story of what happened in Cosenza on July 4th, 2026 is not a story about buildings or budgets. It's not a story about policy reforms or financial audits. It's a story about what happens when an institution becomes so large, so layered with bureaucracy and tradition and self-preservation that it forgets the very people who built it. Pope Leo XIV walked into that hallway and saw something that no report could convey. He saw men who had given everything. Men who had stood at altars and baptismal fonts and hospital bedsides for decades. Men who had counseled the grieving and married the hopeful and prayed for the lost. And now, those men were sitting in rooms with no air conditioning, with broken medical equipment, with no one to call when they fell in the middle of the night. The Church has always taught that the measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable. The Pope discovered that by that standard, his own institution had failed. But here is what matters most. He didn't look away. He didn't delegate. He didn't form a committee and wait for a report. He went, he saw, he wept, and then he acted. Not every problem was solved on that day. The crisis of elderly priest care is decades in the making, and will take years to fully address. But something shifted. A door opened that had been sealed shut by indifference and institutional inertia. And it opened because a 92-year-old priest with trembling hands had the courage to write a letter to a pope he had never met. And because that pope had the courage to read it. In the weeks that followed, Father Herrera's facility received the first major renovation in 15 years. A full-time nurse was hired. Air conditioning was installed. A new call button system was placed in every room. Father Herrera told a visiting journalist that for the first time in years, he slept through the night without worrying about what would happen if he needed help. "The Pope came to my room," he said. "He held my hands. He cried with me. I spent my whole life telling people that God hears their prayers, and on that day I finally believed it myself." The Catholic Church stands at a crossroads. The same institution that has built hospitals and schools and cathedrals across the world must now turn its attention inward. It must look at the men it ordained decades ago, the men who said yes to a life of service, and ask a simple question. Did we keep our promise? Pope Leo XIV answered that question on a July morning in Cosenza. He answered it with tears, and then he answered it with action. The world is watching to see if the rest of the Church will do the same. The ripple effect of that July morning in Cosenza continues to be felt throughout the global Church. What began as a single letter from a frail, forgotten priest transformed into a movement of restoration and accountability. It proved that the heartbeat of the Church is not found in the marble halls of the Vatican or the administrative budgets of a diocese, but in the small, quiet acts of mercy that echo the teachings of Christ. Pope Leo XIV did not merely reform a policy. He challenged the culture of indifference that had allowed the Church to become an institution that sometimes forgot its own. The changes implemented, the emergency funds, the new oversight office, the mandatory reporting, are significant. But the true transformation lies in the shift of consciousness among the faithful. Catholics worldwide are now looking toward their own parishes and retirement homes with a renewed sense of responsibility. They are no longer waiting for official directives to show love to those who have given their lives in service. They are visiting, they are donating, and most importantly, they are ensuring that the men who once stood at their altars are never again left to face the twilight of their lives in silence. The story of Father Herrera and Pope Leo is a stark reminder that every institution, no matter how sacred, is comprised of human beings capable of profound failure and, equally, profound grace. It teaches us that the measure of our faith is found in how we treat the most vulnerable among us. When we choose to see the unseen, when we choose to act instead of looking away, we begin to build the Church that Christ truly intended. One built not on stone, but on a foundation of tangible, relentless love. As you reflect on this story, remember that the forgotten fathers still exist in homes and parishes near you. They may not have the strength to write a letter, but they have the same dignity, the same history of service, and the same need for companionship. You do not need to be a pope to make a difference. You only need to be a neighbor. The call to action is simple. Look around, listen, and offer the gift of your presence. Because in the end, the most powerful thing we can do for one another is to ensure that no one, no matter how old, how tired, or how forgotten, has to face their final years without knowing they are loved. Change the course of history. As we look at the legacy of this moment, we are reminded that faith is not just a collection of rituals or dogmas. It is, above all, an act of love. It is the decision to walk into the places others avoid and to see the people others choose to ignore. Pope Leo XIV did not perform a grand miracle that day in Cosenza. He performed a human one. He simply showed up. For those of you listening, perhaps this story serves as a mirror. Who are the forgotten ones in your own life, in your own community, or in your own family? Who is waiting for a visit, a letter, or a simple acknowledgement of their dignity? The Church is not just a building in Rome. It is the community of believers, and it is built by the actions of every single one of you. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that reminds us of the power of compassion. Leave a comment below and tell us what you think the Church should do for its oldest and most forgotten priests. Your voice matters. And, as Father Herrera proved, sometimes a single message can be the beginning of a revolution of love.